Okay, you have your NFL tier list. Which teams have improved after free agency? So you have your major improvements, teams that had a lot of them improved their team a lot during the offseason. Slight improvement, the same, pretty much the same, slightly worse, and then a lot worse. First things first, you got the Titans. They didn't do much. They resigned a few guys. Resigned was it Landry, and didn't really. They pretty much stayed the same. They did sign Austin Hooper and traded for Robert Woods, but they released Julio Jones in it, and they also lost a few defensive starters. So I say they pretty much stay the same. Then you got the Miami Dolphins. They pretty much re-signed their defense. They did not in their defense. I don't think they added a new starter, but they didn't lose any starters either. Their defense is the same, but on the offense is where they made the most improvement. They signed Terran Armstead, Connor Williams on the line. They got Tyreek Hill, and they brought in Raheem Mostert and Chase Edmonds. And I say their defense is the same, but for their offense, there has been major, major improvements. There's no excuses for Tua now. For me, just getting Tyreek Hill, that's a major improvement. Then you have the New York Jets. They made a ton of underrated signings. They got like what two or three offensive linemen, and got two or three offensive linemen and a couple people in the secondary. A couple people in the secondary, like what was Whitehead, the safety that was from Tampa Bay, and definitely underrated signing, but no superstars, which is why I put in slight improvement. But if because some of them might not work out. Then you have the Bengals. They signed mostly offensive linemen. Signed like three offensive linemen. They did not do. They were not that active. We signed a couple of guys, but they just weren't that active. But they did improve their offensive line, so I put that in slight improvement. Then you have the Cleveland Browns. That being the biggest thing, being Deshaun Watson. They got Deshaun Watson. Not sure if he's gonna get suspended or not, but whatever. Other than that, didn't really they weren't really that active outside of Deshaun Watson. They did they did cut a couple of guys, like Jarvis Landry, J.C. Treader, and traded away their linebacker. They weren't that active, but just getting Deshaun Watson is a lot. Deshaun Watson's better than Mayfield, but they also lost a couple of pieces. I put them in slight improvement. Then you have the Jacksonville Jaguars. They got a bunch of players. They got a linebacker from the Atlanta defensive tackle. They overpaid for Christian Kirk and Zay Jones on the wide receiver. Did they do anything for the offensive line? Yeah, they got him Brandon Sheriff. So they definitely improved. Similar to I think their free agents are gonna do better than say the Jets. I say they're pretty similar in terms of their free agency, similar to the Jets, but the free agents are slightly more known. And they brought in a lot of players, and they just brought in a lot of players. So I say they majorly improved, because their roster was trash. Then you got the Lions. Lions are sitting on the draft. The only major starter I believe they brought in was DJ Chark. Outside of that, it was pretty much the same old team from last year. And DJ Chark is definitely an improvement, but not that much. I'd say they're pretty much the same team. They have to nail this draft, nail the 2022 draft. Vikings, not much moves. They just didn't do too much. They lost their tight end and just didn't make any really big moves, but the same. Then you have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Biggest being Tom Brady unretiring. They did re-sign a couple of guys. They also lost a couple of the guys too, especially along their offensive line. They lost like what was it, Kappa and Marpet to free agency and unretiring, but they also made up with a couple of cornerback signing and training for the offensive guard. So I say they also signed a few more receivers. So I say they stayed the same. Then you have San Francisco 49ers. San Francisco's they did not do much. They signed like three cornerbacks and signed a couple of other secondary base players, whereas like backup players. They didn't really lose many players either, so they didn't really make any moves. I put them the same. Then you have the Atlanta Falcons. They are just in full rebuild right now. Traded away Matt Ryan, signed Marcus Mariota, which is clearly worse. Had a bunch of their free agents sign away. They were a lot worse. Then the Baltimore Ravens did not make many moves, like at all. I say they stay the same. Then you have the Chicago Bears, an interesting case. They didn't really sign anybody. They really didn't sign anybody, to be honest. Their biggest signing was that defensive tackle, Ojanabani or something, and he ended up failing his physical. They didn't really lose anybody. They lost Khalil Mack. That's their one big loss. No, wait, they also lost Allen Robinson. So they did have a couple of big losses, and they didn't really sign anybody. So I put them as slightly worse. Actually, I put them a lot worse. Then you have the Dallas Cowboys. Didn't really do much. They actually definitely they did some things like added signed like what was it, Hooker or a couple safeties, but they lost a lot. They lost like Williams on the offensive line. They lost Cedric Wilson, Amari Cooper, and their defense really didn't lose too many. They lost Randy Gregory, but at least they got DeMarcus Lawrence to re-sign. But they did make a couple of good moves, but they lost a lot more. So I'd say they got a lot worse. Then you got the Houston Texans. Another year, pretty much they signed a bunch of backup guys onto like 1-2 year deals. They're just pretty much the same team. Then you have the Indianapolis Colts. Really didn't do much. Did not really do much. Their biggest move being Matt Ryan. But if you look trading for what is it? Ngakwe, was it? From the Raiders. Those two moves, and then the rest was pretty much re-signing and keeping their players. That put them in slight improvement. Only slight though. Then you have the LA Rams. They brought in Allen Robinson, but they traded away Robert Woods. But their biggest signing being Bobby Wagner. They re-signed a bunch of guys, keeping their core together. Bobby Wagner and Allen Robinson, biggest signings, and that's definitely a slight improvement, but not much. Then you have the Chargers. They got Khalil Mack. They got J.C. Jackson. Those two alone are major improvements to their defense. They re-signed Mike Williams, and I don't believe they lost too many guys, so I put them in major improvement. Then you have the Raiders. The Raiders. They traded for Devontae Adams. They re-signed a hot ton of players, a lot of them. Re-signed a ton of players. They signed Devontae Adams, and Devontae Adams enough was a major improvement to their team. Then you have the Washington football team. They did not do anything. Signed a bunch of backup guys. They did trade for Carson Wentz, but I think they they gave up 2/3 and had to take on Carson Wentz's contract. I don't think that's worth it. I put them in slightly worse. Even though Carson Wentz is a player, I think he gave up too much assets and cap space for him. Then you got the Kansas City Chiefs. They lost Tyreek Hill, lost Tyrann Mathieu. They lost their cornerback Ward, and they made up for signing Reed and what was the two receivers, Smith Schuster and MBS. But they really didn't do much to improve, and they did lose their main cornerback Ward, and they didn't really sign anybody to replace him. Put them in slightly worse. Then you have the New Orleans Saints. Definitely lost a lot of guys. Lost their safety, both their safeties. Lost Armstead, and they really did not improve. They're in cap hell right now. Had to restructure a bunch of guys. There's no way this roster got any better, though. It's only slightly worse. Then you have the Giants. Their roster is not good, and they did not really sign anybody. Their biggest signing was what was it? The Tyrod Taylor, QB, and offensive lineman Mark Longwinski. That was pretty much it. They're the same team. Then you have the Eagles. Easily the biggest signing was Hassan Reddick, a linebacker, and White, also a linebacker. And they also got a couple of receivers, Pascal and some other receiver, and they definitely improved. They definitely didn't really lose money, guys. They definitely improved at the linebacker position, arguably their weakest position last year, and improved their wide receiving corps. So I put them at slight improvement. And you have the Pittsburgh Steelers. Their biggest move has to be signing Mitchell Trubisky, which I don't know, that may or may not work out, and James Daniels. And they also lost a couple of guys. I cannot say they improved. They lost too much, and they didn't really sign any like true like team that can elevate them. So I just say that they're the same old team. Then you got the Denver Broncos. They biggest move traded for traded for Russell Wilson and they signed Randy Gregory. They did lose a couple like the tight end Fant and Shelby Harris, but I like their move so far. And getting a franchise QB, what better than that? Do major improvement. Then you have the Green Bay Packers. Biggest loss, they lost Devontae Adams and they did not replace him, or have not replaced him yet. They might replace him during the draft. They did sign a couple other people like Campbell, Douglas, but those are re-signings. So they didn't really sign any new free agents. And they're definitely, I put them at a lot worse. Devontae Adams is going to be hard to replace. In the Panthers, they definitely made some underrated moves so far. I think their biggest was Hecker at punter, and they signed Littleton at linebacker and Dante Foreman at running back. But those aren't exactly the moves that improve your team much at all. So those moves, they just don't improve your team enough. So I put them at the same old team. Then you have the Cardinals. Pretty much they re-signed James Conner, and that's pretty much it. That's the only real significant move for them, so I put them at the same. Okay. Then you have the Buffalo Bills. The biggest signing has to be Von Miller, but other than that, they didn't really sign. They signed a couple of offensive linemen, which is good. They signed Duke Johnson, but Von Miller alone is not going to put them in the slightly improvement. So I'm gonna put them at the same. And then you have Seattle, probably the biggest losers so far in free agency. They lost Russell Wilson. You have to go in a lot worse category if you lose your franchise QB. And really, they signed a couple of new people in the secondary, but most of their new acquisition players have come from the Russell Wilson trade, like Shelby Harris. But those aren't enough to overcome the loss of Russell Wilson, so they're a lot worse. Then you got the Patriots. They really haven't done anything in free agency. They lost a couple of offensive linemen, cut and let walk a couple of defensive players, but they really haven't added anything. So I put them as slightly worse. So this is my tier. So there you have it, my NFL tier list for the most improved teams after free agency.